Remakes are an excellent way of re-experiencing classics. While the act of remaking a game can sometimes compromise its artistic integrity, if the developers provide due care to ensuring that a remake remains fidel to the source material, then the remake can itself become an instant classic. I personally believe that a remake should be more ambitious than the original. Being iterative is not enough when you're dealing with a gaming giant. It's important to recontextualize the source material in the context of modern gaming. Of course, those who love the original might argue that fidelity should be prioritized, that a classic is a classic and that it does not need to be retouched beyond some simple graphical tweaks. This dilemma surrounding remakes and fidelity is one that marks Demon's Souls' otherwise stellar reception. As a launch game for the PS5, Demon's Souls was more than just a remake of the game that started it all. It was an opportunity for Sony to show off the features of their shiny new console. While most newcomers, and many Souls veterans who never played the original, were awestruck by this astounding looking game, fans of the PS3 game were more divided. The Demon's Souls remake trades the dreary, damp atmosphere of the original for a more familiar fantasy aesthetic, a change that many lovers of the original condemn. The reason for this extended prelude to my critique of the game is that I find the debate about the optimal aesthetic for this game, as well as the wider discussion about how true to form remakes need to be a very legitimate and interesting one. Unfortunately, having never played the original, I don't think that I can comment on the creative liberties the remake takes in interpreting the world of Politaria. What I can say is that, having seen some footage of the original, I think that the crowd of naysayers actually present a compelling argument regarding the radical shift in tone of the new graphics. As a newcomer, I can also appreciate just how magnificent everything in the remake looks. From the cobblestone walls of the palace to the towers of Latria to the wonderfully rendered particles, it's clear that a lot of love was put into making the remake look like it does. The fast loading times and consistently high frame rates show off the raw power of the new PlayStation, and Demon's Souls is, in my eyes, still the definitive PS5 experience, 2 years into its life cycle. I also greatly appreciate the modern conveniences that the remake offers, like the additional directions of movement and the ability to send items to storage when you can't carry them. What has been retained from the original shines, even over a decade after its release. And while I cannot resolve the argument of fidelity over creative control, I hope that I can provide an entertaining critique of the game the way that I experienced it for the first time on my PS5 in 2023. Considering just how ubiquitous the Soulsborne school of game design has become, it's hard to believe that the game that, in the eyes of many, started it all, had little success in part because of that tough but fair gameplay loop that is its main draw. While it's hard to detach the level design of these games from their core gameplay, I'll try my best to save any talk about the interlooping corridors and the checkpoints that lie between them till I start talking about my playthrough. Even if we excise level design from the talk about core gameplay, it's still difficult to describe what that gameplay will look like for each player, since there is a huge amount of options to choose from when it comes to speccing your build in this game. I went for a dexterous sword fighter who, after getting to the third world, emerged as a budding mage with a catalyst that seemed like a boon but was actually severely limiting my DPS. Others might choose to go for a melee tank build, or a build that uses status effects like poison to their usually unfair advantage, or an absolutely broken mage who can one shot bosses with a fire attack. At the very core of this gameplay, there's a rather simple loop of dodging attacks, parrying strikes if your shield allows, and fighting back using either a melee weapon, a long range bow, or spells that work at varying ranges. All builds are viable here, but some reign superior. Many enemies and bosses in the game are especially vulnerable to magic attacks, which means that most of these worlds are a breeze if you're a well spec mage. And that's without me giving due consideration to the fact that magic also allows you to keep your attackers at an arm's length as you plow through their health. I'd heard that magic was broken in this game, but I didn't realize that, to defeat some bosses, it was more or less a downright necessity. I struggled a lot for the first part of my original playthrough because I didn't have access to the spells that make a mage build viable. When I got these spells, I continued to struggle for a bit as I grappled with the idea of trading my sword for a catalyst, till I found out that some swords scale with magic, making them incredibly potent in most situations. I struggled again when I entered New Game Plus because I was using a catalyst that wasn't scaling with my magic power. The obscurity of some of the game's stats can make choosing a good build hard, but with sufficient trial and error, it's possible to make any build work. Another way to try and understand the gameplay of this game is in tandem with its peers. I found the gameplay of Demon Souls to be much less reactive than that of Bloodborne and Sekiro, with a lot more offensive options than the latter of the two offers. It's much more similar to the first Dark Souls game than it is to the third, and taking your time, letting your shield take some hits as you figure your enemy out is a major part of what you're likely to be doing here. This methodical gameplay does make some enemies particularly vulnerable to being cheesed, but quite a few will eat through your stamina or cause chip damage if you aren't spec'd for attack tennis. I also found rolling to be less viable than it is in something like Bloodborne or DS3, and there was a slight delay there that put me off relying on rolling to avoid attacks. There are a few more things to talk about regarding gameplay. Firstly, a lot of combat in this game takes place in tight corridors. This limit to maneuverability also means that mages and ranged fighters reign supreme again, since many swords will hit the side of the corridors and effectively cancel the hit. Secondly, many boss runs in this game are truly egregious, and while I won't delve into the specifics yet, the interlooping nature of the Dark Souls series is present here, but only in some locations and in a more rudimentary fashion. The penultimate point I want to bring up is regarding the healing system. There are no self replenishing healing flasks in this game. Instead, you need to farm for and store a variety of healing items to be able to heal at all. This can be a bit annoying, but by about midway through the game, there are plenty of great farming spots, and you'll likely be making use of them very rarely anyway. This does also mean that you can tweak the difficulty for yourself by either loading up on herbs or setting limits for yourself on how many you're allowed to carry at one time. Finally, the upgrade system in this game is simultaneously simpler and more elusive than it is in other Souls titles. There are plenty of different weapon types that require specific upgrade materials, and then there are more specific upgrade paths that you can take with even more obscure upgrade materials to find and farm. There's also the fact that there are two blacksmiths, and there's a chance that you might completely miss the second of the two, the one who offers boss weapons and complicated upgrades. I did not like the upgrade system in this game, but maybe that's just because of the choices I made with my weapons early in the game and how hard I found it to farm the simplest of upgrade materials for some weapon classes. With all of that out of the way, let's finally talk about the game. Psych. There's one more thing I need to cover that I forgot all about, and that is the tendency system. Chances are that if you've played the game, you've never properly engaged with this system, if you even know of its existence to begin with. I, unfortunately, have a masochistic need to platinum every single one of these god-forsaken games, and as a result, I've had to learn the ins and outs of the system, and oh boy, is it something. I know that people critique these games for being quite opaque in terms of their storytelling and how they explain game mechanics, but I've always been able to find reliable resources that have helped me wrap my head around both of those things. The world tendency system is a whole other beast, though. Essentially, each of the levels of this game have their own independent world tendency, which, depending on your actions, triggers certain in game events. If you've been killing NPCs or even so much as dying too much in a certain level in human form, the world tendency will start to become more negative, opening up certain doors while locking others, and summoning seriously overpowered red phantoms for you to defeat. If you've been a good boy, in that you've been killing hostile NPCs like the aforementioned red phantoms, bosses, or other players who invade your game, your world will tend towards white tendency, making the game slightly easier by boosting your health and attack bar. What's so interesting is that there are some NPCs who turn hostile or have the potential to harm other NPCs in your game, and I couldn't find concrete answers for whether or not killing these NPCs turns your world more black. Also interesting is the fact that if your blade accidentally repeatedly hits an NPC who just so happens to have a ring you want and you want to get your world tendency back to white, you need to first get it down to pure black to get red phantoms to spawn, whom you can subsequently defeat to fix your world tendency. Of course, if you're online, you can just kill invaders, but the even more obscure matchmaking system and the level caps nested within it complemented the fact that my Wi-Fi is shit poor on a good day to successfully brew the perfect concoction that resulted in me having to go through these extremely tedious processes multiple times. And that's not to mention the fact that there's multiple levels of both light and dark tendency that's calculated in terms of percentages that need to be estimated by the player by eyeing the amount that the world tendency logo associated with a specific level is glowing and whether or not there are tiny particles surrounding it. Oh, and there's also a global character tendency that works on different rules that you also need to take care of. You think the flame lurker was bad? Wait till you try to figure out the elaborate saw trap that is this game's morality system. God, I love FromSoft. Spoiler warning right here, I'm going to talk in depth about my entire playthrough from start to finish now. Consider yourself warned. Demon's Souls starts off with a pre-rendered cutscene that any Soulspawn fans would definitely be anticipating. Where this game differs from its contemporaries is in the fact that an understanding of its story can be gleaned without the need to scan item descriptions for esoteric knowledge, although doing so will certainly bolster your understanding of the game as a whole. The first playable area is a tutorial which introduces you to the basics, an inconsistent vault mechanic, attacks and riposte that are general fare with these games, and the borderline unbeatable circle strafing technique that you will actually have to use to defeat the first seemingly unkillable boss of this game. Although you will have your literal living daylights punched out by the demon god, even if you manage to do so in a manner that's very reminiscent of my last Tinder date. With that, you get introduced to the Nexus, and goddamn is it a sight to behold. With its translucent base, cryptic symbols, towering heights, and alluring stone pillars, the Nexus makes for a striking hub world. There's some NPCs here as well, and the place will get more populated as you find more NPCs in the overworld. The ill-tempered blacksmith and the kindly stockholder are two whom you'll be really familiar with by the end of your adventure though. Also, the fact that the game doesn't need you to have upgrade materials in your inventory while you power up is a kindness that I can't not acknowledge. Proceeding to the first Arkstone, you'll find yourself teleported to a beautiful castle with a slight tracking problem. The first area is brutal if it's your first time through the game. The game ups its relatively manageable difficulty by putting you in cramped rooms and hallways where you're more likely to swing your weapon into the wall than at enemies, something that's more aggravating for you than it is for the voluminist, and that's saying something. This area will keep you on your toes, but it will also introduce you to most of the tricks in FromSoft SAC. There's enemies hiding behind doorways, enemies hiding at sharp turns, and enemies waiting to ambush you from afar with rocks that are on fire. Get through the spires, and you'll land in a courtyard with this rather inept knight named Ostrava, whom I accidentally killed for a ring on my first playthrough without realizing that this uninformed decision of mine would cause me a ton of pain as I tried to get to pure white character tendency later on. Moving on, what I love about this area is how simple the enemies and their attack patterns are, and how difficult they can be to defeat regardless. In this game, more so than any other Soulspawn, I felt the pressure that even the simplest of enemies could put on you, particularly in hazardous environments or when you're ganged up on. Fighting through the castle, you eventually come to a wall where you meet your first dragon. Unfortunately, politeness is not its forte, so it proceeds to try and burn you along with all the other enemies on the wall. Persevere and you encounter a switch, pulling which opens the door to the first official boss fight, as well as the door for me to talk about what is simultaneously my favorite and least favorite part of this game. Every time you die, you're spawned at the last Arkstone, of which there are 4 in each world. What this effectively means is that the devs needed to get creative with how they made the levels to ensure that the Arkstone was within reach of the boss room. This gives rise to a hallmark of FromSoft games, their interwoven and interlacing level design. This is on full display throughout the Boletaria Palace. There's multiple shortcuts that loop you back to previously discovered locations, and opening these triggers an aha moment that fans of FromSoft games will be very familiar with. With the Phalanx boss fight, the devs literally put the boss gate right in front of the Arkstone, making it your responsibility to go on a mini adventure to find the lever that opens it, tying together the design of this whole first section in a very clever way. Unfortunately, this level of quality is not maintained throughout the rest of the worlds. Boletaria Palace is consistently good, and World 2 and 3 are also generally well planned. By the time you get to the last 2 worlds, though, the boss runs get ridiculously long, and, in the absence of any shortcuts, frequently incredibly tedious. I understand that it's tough to have the level design be consistently fantastic across the board, But the last two worlds feel somewhat like afterthoughts in comparison to what comes before them as a result of this complacency. Back to the palace, it's time to meet our first boss. This is where I should mention that I love most of the bosses in this game, which is why I find it to be incredibly humorous that the first one that I fought was an amorphous blob that was composed of similarly amorphous blobs that separate from a blue core that actually takes damage. This boss is a joke. It's also a pushover, but it's a joke first and a pushover second. I mean, when you have the Tar Knight as the fight that comes right after this one, it's extremely hard to justify why the devs set their worst foot forward with Phalanx. The strategy, should you need one, is to patiently take down the smaller blobs as they detach from the glowing body of the Phalanx. Or you could simply lob some fire spells or bombs at it and see the boss kill itself out of embarrassment. Moving swiftly on from that sad excuse for a boss, you need to traverse a really long fort wall that's littered with enemies. More concerning, however, is the giant dragon looming overhead, who will come to rain fiery terror anytime he sees you in a spot he doesn't like. Exercising caution and agility alike, you need to time your movements to avoid its breath attacks as you fight your way through archers to the other side of this wall, where you then fight some strong knights. There's no shortcuts here, but the boss run is literally a straight line, and the set piece of the dragon is one to behold. What lies through the fog gate makes the long walk that you'll inevitably be repeating worth it though. The next boss, and what I'll dub the real first boss, of this game is the Tar Knight, and boy does he really put the tar in Tar Knight. This colossus makes for an imposing figure. You can only whittle away at its whittled ankles with your whittled blade as it attacks you or sidesteps to evade your blows. Thankfully, the knight's hulking frame means that his attacks are rather slow, although you will probably need to stay on your toes as you attack its toes because its AoEs can devastate your health bar if you don't get out of the way fast enough. What doesn't help is that there are archers surrounding the arena, and in taking them out, you risk being hit by the knight's magic attacks. There's a lot to consider in this fight, and it sets a fairly high bar for the bosses to come, if only because of the sheer spectacle of it all. Mechanically, I find that the gimmick of having the knight fall like Humpty Dumpty once you've had a tantrum on its legs, like a little toddler, is also pretty engaging. Although the knight will sometimes fall in a position where it's impossible to reach its head to deal real damage to it. An important lesson this fight teaches you is that it's sometimes a better idea to forego locking onto your target. In this fight, locking onto the knight's legs can make it significantly tougher for you to weave around to avoid its attacks, and it's a better choice to just hit the massive targets that are its knees without actually having the camera lock onto them. Having defeated the Tar Knight, let's next tackle another prominent issue, that of the structure of this video. I'll essentially be going through the Arkstones in the order that I did them in. What this means is that we'll next be talking about 2-1 and not 1-3 because I didn't get to 1-3 until much later. I did make a mistake that many people who've bounced off of Dark Souls 1 will probably be able to relate to. I accidentally walked into a giant open area with too many skeletons. See, after defeating the first boss, you're given free reign over which area you want to tackle next. The best choice to make here, I believe, is 2-1. If you, like me, instead walk into 4-1, you'll likely be trampled by these agile skeletons who are extremely reminiscent of the ones who guard the catacombs in Dark Souls. I think that as you progress, it's a better idea to go through the initial parts of each area because they're scaled sort of similarly across the board, with the later sections of each Arkstone being much more difficult in comparison. For my first playthrough, I found 2-1 to be the most viable choice, at least in part because most of the enemies in the mines are passive until you attack them. This does make for some rather terrifying jump scares though, since there are aggressive enemies littered amongst the packs of dedicated workers. Although these enemies hit really slow, their damage output is incredibly high, and they only take real damage from backstabs or magic attacks. What I love about this game is that each Arkstone is distinct in terms of its aesthetic, general vibe, and characteristic mechanic. Sure, the world feels a little disjointed, but I think that this 90s platformer structure works surprisingly well here. Anyway, this area does contain outwardly aggressive enemies as well. The first one you'll encounter are a pack of wolves who are the second most annoying enemies in this game. These wolves can fuck you up. And that's without taking the fact that you might accidentally aggro passive mobs while trying to catch up with these agile beasts into action. This is also where you meet your first fat official, and they're these dastardly bastards who use fire attacks and whips. They're slow, but they hit really hard. I'm noticing a theme with the enemies in this area. Fight some more dudes in narrow corridors, and you eventually come to an opening with a lava pit that you need to disable by pulling a lever at the opposite end of the level, similar to what you did with the boss gate for Phalanx, although the actual run ends up being much longer here. There's a shortcut you can unlock, but I had been too afraid to go down that path that leads to the shortcut the first time I played this game. Crossing the pit, there's a bit of a run up before you get to an elevator that leads you to the actual boss. What I enjoy about this area is that you get the feeling that you're slowly descending into hell. Each section has some sort of a descent, and this elevator is just the start of that. The boss of this area is the armored spider. The spider proves that FromSoft can do static, puzzle type bosses really well if they try. This boss doesn't move at all, but it has an attack where it sends a wave of fire across the arena that you need to race to the end of the room before you make your way back to the boss to deal some damage. The boss itself is always dangerous, and you'll need to get used to dodging past its sticky webs and flaming shots before you can beat it. Up close and personal, it has some damaging attacks, but I found that staying squarely in front of it and keeping my shield up to block an attack before following with one of my own was a very effective strategy. This next area is a doozy. There's a fork in the road at the first intersection, and each of these paths end in varying levels of pain. To the left are minecarts carrying explosives, followed by a fat official, followed by an elevator that leads you to a magma-ridden rock formation where you can also find patches who'll try to trick you into killing yourself by means of flame monster. There's a bunch of items to pick up in this area, and there's an offshoot that leads to a maze of mining system which does at some point open near the boss room. But if you're trying to get to the boss itself, it's probably a better idea to rewind and take the part to the right of the intersection, which leads you to a platforming section. I know what you're thinking. A platforming section in a FromSoft game? Well, they've done it before and they'll do it again. And no amount of unresponsive, rigid controls will stop FromSoft from putting platforming sections in their action RPGs. You're essentially dropping down a really long mineshaft directly into the depths of hell here. The fall itself is quite treacherous, but you'll need to find the least damaging route down because of what lies at the gates of hell. No, it's not Cerberus. It's something less cute and much less fun. It's the Flame Lurker. The Flame Lurker has made it to the top of many a Demon Souls boss rankings, and for good reason. This boss has an incredibly long health bar. Trying to beat it with the pure melee build I'd been running till now was nigh on impossible. This thing has some really quick attacks, given its size, and the additional fire damage it deals can turn any hit you sustain near fatal. There's 3 ways to deal with this guy. The first is to cheese it using the arena set dressing that is a potential deadly annoyance in and of itself. The second is to bring a ton of healing items and only allow the beast to deal chip damage to you through your shield. The third, of course, is to get good, by which I mean get a magic attack from 3-1 before returning to this fight and watching the Flame Lurker go down in mere minutes as you watch from across the battlefield. Guess which one I chose? Now, technically, I should be walking us through World 3-1 because I took a break from the Flame Lurker fight to bring the absolutely broken weapon of mass destruction that was the sole way to tip the odds in my favor with this guy. But since the third checkpoint of each area essentially just leads to the final boss of that Arkstone, I think it's better if I talk about the Dragon God first before moving on. The Dragon God is another one of those puzzle bosses, but this time it's less a puzzle and more a stealth challenge. The god sits facing the area you'll be running around it, and it's your job to hide behind pillars and fire off these great arrows into his body to bring him down. It's innovative, to be certain, but it abandons the excellent combat of this game for a gimmick that's only fun for as long as you're able to figure out what you're supposed to do. The execution is a bit wonky. There are these obstructions that you need to break littered across the area, and you need to play a bit of a balancing act between hiding behind pillars and taking down these obstructions. In particular, the first arrow is behind this one obstruction that you need to break the first time you get to it, because running back to cover is simply not possible in the limited time you have before the god attacks. This is antithetical to the patience that this boss seems to be preaching so far, and it makes for an incredibly frustrating death if you don't YOLO it the first time. Once the Dragon God is down, you still need to be cautious of its flame breath as you sink it to sleep slowly and painfully with fists you can't even wield, because hey, there's a trophy for that. The next area is aesthetically my favorite. The green glow emanating from the Tower of Latria just screams cosmic horror. And the Cthulhu-looking prison guards you're going to be fighting in the prison section of this Arkstone confirm that something creeper is looming just below the surface. The Prison of Hope can be extremely difficult to navigate given its instant death falls and keys that require you to backtrack to open new paths. I didn't have too much trouble with the first two floors of this place though, since I understood what the level layout was going to be after I collected the first key. But descending down to the lower floors did disorientate me a bit, and I ran around on the wrong side of the level trying to find a key to advance. The prison guards make for some extremely annoying enemies as well, what with difficult to dodge paralyzing blasts and the health sucking attack that they follow those up with. The narrow confines of the balconies don't help the situation either. Eventually, though, you come across a more open area with the statue spitting arrows at you. You can either roll through these to the other side or find an alternative route across to shut the arrow down. The boss run here is fairly long, but there's a single quote unquote shortcut you can open up to make it easier on yourself. Before you face the boss, it's prudent to take out this guy who's seated on a balcony overlooking the boss arena because he heals the fool's idol if you don't take him out before initiating the fight. With that, there's just one red phantom NPC standing between you and the boss, who would be a pain if she weren't so easy to simply run past. The Fool's Idol boss is another unique puzzle boss, one that inspires a beloved boss in the first Dark Souls game. This pinwheel prototype creates multiple copies of herself, leaving it up to you to find the real one from the bunch. The color of the magic spells the copies shoot at you are a dead giveaway, but unlike Pinwheel, the Fool's Idol has another trick up her sleeve that makes this fight exponentially harder than that boss. There's paralyzing engravings on the floor that trigger when you walk over them, leaving you vulnerable for a barrage of attacks from the Idol and her clones. This fight can become incredibly tense, since you have to keep in mind the locations of the disappearing runes before dodging an endless valley of spells, trying to identify the real idol from a pool of ersatz ones. I enjoy this fight, but the boss run up to it and the slightly gimmicky nature of it can make it kinda annoying. Not as annoying as the next area though, but we'll take a slight detour before we head there. While the first portion of the tower has a long boss run, the second portion of the tower is extremely long and treacherous throughout, and the boss that the area culminates in is probably the hardest one in the game. I got frustrated partway through that area and instead decided to return to the stormy cliff face bereft with angry skeletons. Yeah, 3-2 was that bad. Having leveled up my character a bit and unlocked some magics, I was able to hold my own against the skeletons at the start of this area. Proceeding past the battlements on the cliff, you find that Vanguard demon from the start of the game, and you actually have a decent chance of defeating it this time around. There are dungeons in this area, ones that have illusory walls, but if you want to get to the boss, you just need to proceed up some battlements, fight a katana wielding skeleton, and drop down lower on the cliff and follow a narrow ledge around to a hole in the wall that's very easy to miss. All of this while being ambushed by various kinds of skeletons and having magic spears brought down upon you by stingrays floating high up in the sky. Still easier than 3-2 though. The boss here is the Adjudicator, and this guy has a serious thorn in his side. Literally, and if you hit that thorn hard enough, he'll fall and let you hit this bird thingy on his head that is the only damageable part of its body. Very similar to the Tower Knight, but in a much smaller arena, and much easier to cheese with magic, since there are convenient ledges you can camp on while raining down soul arrows on the bird. It's a fun fight, but not a particularly challenging one on the first NG cycle. 4-2 is another one of those areas that makes you cuss out the one checkpoint per boss run level design of this game. There's absolutely no shortcuts, so being killed by the boss means that you have to go through the entire level over again, and it's a pretty tough level to make it through even the first time around. There are these necromancers that spawn ghosts to hunt you down. The necromancers themselves are tough fighters, but what really adds salt to the wound is that they don't stay dead when you respawn. Couple this with the fact that you're going to be traversing some really narrow ledges which are easy to fall down while handling tough skellies and the aforementioned magic spears, and this makes for one hell of a ride. At least the view's nice. I cannot reiterate how much I hate this section, and I was sort of hoping that the boss of this area would make up for it. But lo and behold, the boss is yet another puzzle to be solved. The old hero makes an awesome entry into the boss arena, but he's quite easy to dispatch of if you've acquired the Thieves Ring on your way here. The old hero can't see you, and with the Thieves Ring equipped, he can't hear you either, making Death by 1,000 Cuts the way to go with this boss. The fight is easy if done this way, and I wasn't willing to risk having to do the entire boss run just to prove that I had gotten good in this game. Sure, I chose the coward's way out, but at least I didn't have to waste another hour of my life trying to appease the RNG gods, trying to get the skeletons I had to face on my way to the boss to jump off the cliff themselves. I might have lost my dignity, but I didn't lose my mind, and that's all that matters. Following up one strange and unique boss with another, FromSoft decided to put a huge spectacle for the final boss of the Hearthstone. The Storm King is a giant flying stingray who only spawns if you kill a sufficient number of smaller flying stingrays with either ranged attacks or this really cool sword capable of firing projectiles. After that, it's a simple case of hiding in a hut, waiting for the Storm King to unleash a volley of spears on you before you follow up with ones of your own. This is a battle of attrition, one that's beautiful to look at, if a bit mechanically unsatisfying. Having braved the cliffs, I thought I would be well equipped to deal with 3-2. Unfortunately, I hadn't anticipated just how much of a task it would be to defeat the boss of that area, so I found myself once again in the Borataria Palace. Journeying through this section, I realized that the palace was definitely given the better end of the stick of all the Archstones as far as the level design was concerned. Making our way through some rooftops, defeating grunts and archers in the process, you eventually cross a bridge with a strong knight guarding it. On the other side, there's a fat official and his huge entourage to fight. With archers and assassins in the mix, this next area is pretty tough, but it's also a great place to farm some healing items. Of course, farming would indicate that you were intentionally respawning and going on the same path over and over again. What's more likely is that you die a lot and have to keep returning to collect your souls in this area, with the stockpile of healing items being a fortuitous side effect. This area also smartly loops back upon itself, allowing you to unlock a shortcut really close to the Archstone that leaves only a short run up to the boss. Outside the boss gate, however, there's a gang of strong knights to deal with first. Again, these are great to farm healing items from, and again, the farming will definitely not be intentional because these guys are tough to get rid of. Past the fog gate lies the Penetrator. Now, I know that with a name like that, the boss seems more like an innuendo than a fearsome foe, but let's hear him out. The Penetrator has an extremely long blade that it loves sticking into your body. To be fair, it's not the size of the blade that matters, but how he uses it, and his technique is definitely indicative of a great personality. The first time I got into a dance with this boss, I was accompanied by a friend, and unfortunately, it was all over too soon. Both the penetrator and my friend finished first, and I was just left standing awkwardly on the side. Having a solo session with the penetrator really allows you to become familiar with his tool, but sticking it to him from behind is the best strategy to use, and if you keep at it, you will reach climax in no time. Feeling dirty after all of that? Great, because now we are headed to the swamp. Only briefly though, because I attempted the Valley of Defilement for just a moment before I gave up and returned to 3-2. You know what? Let's talk about the valley later and focus on the slightly more manageable hellscape that is the tower first. The second section of the tower requires you to break some chains that are holding up a giant heart to open a path that allows you to ascend the spire to where the boss of the area resides. To do that, you need to walk across some narrow ledges as gargoyle statues come to life and attack you from all sides. Like in all Souls games, gravity is your greatest enemy, and any misstep or failure of the lock-on system can prove to be potentially fatal. What I don't like about this area is how long it goes on for. After cutting the first chain, I thought for sure that the part to the other would be an offshoot nearer to the Archstone that I simply missed. But no, the game requires you to go on an extremely linear, extremely long and challenging path to the next chain. There's a blood swamp for God's sake, what more do I need to say? Oh, and remember those Cthulhu monsters? Yeah, there's a buffed up version of those looming the towers here too. I did not enjoy the lack of any shortcuts, but I was at least glad that the road to the boss was a short run up a spiral staircase, till I realized that there was another powered up Cthulhu monster on that very staircase. Oh, FromSoft, how I love you. Finally, let's talk about the boss itself. Man-Eater, or Man-Eaters to be more accurate, are a 2-for-1 gargoyle fight that starts off simple but gets much, much tougher as it goes on. Initially, there's only one gargoyle to fight. This guy hits hard, and the narrow pathway you fight him on, coupled with his charge attack, means that your first priority should be ensuring that you're placed in such a way that you won't fall off when he hits you. He also has a snake for a tail. A snake that can potentially enrage him and that can definitely fire magic attacks at you. If you take off the tail, the gargoyle loses the magic attacks, but he still has a ranged roar that can knock you clean off the platform. This boss requires you to learn its attacks inside out and know how to dodge each of them. Oh, and once you've done that, good work! Now try to figure out how you're going to use that knowledge to also defeat a second version of this guy who flies in partway through the fight. Honestly, this boss is nails, and trying to separate the two gargoyles is a task. Focusing fire on one to take it out of commission before dealing with the next is the way to go. And you have to be as aggressive as possible to be able to manage that. Using magic abilities to get some extra damage in while the gargoyles are flying is a good idea. On New Game Plus, I found that I could sometimes get one of the gargoyles to completely lose aggro and try to exit the arena if I used the Thief's Ring and ran from one end of the arena to the other, but consistently defeating both of them individually was challenging enough in and of itself. This fight is slightly ridiculous, and this and the Flame Lurker make me glad that there are more puzzle bosses than straight up combat ones in this game. The next boss is the Old Monk, and it is an interesting one to round up this area with. Essentially, the monk summons a defender, or any random player, into your game if you're online. It was the first PvP boss in any of the FromSoft games, and that makes it have a certain amount of prestige. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, the quality of the boss and your mileage with it will vary depending on matchmaking. Playing offline provides a more consistent experience and an easier one, since the NPC you fight is a bit of a cakewalk. The path leading up to this boss has multiple Phantom Cthulhus though, so that's something to be wary of. The Valley of Defilement. I hate this area so much that I don't actually think that it deserves to be discussed in depth like the rest of the Hearthstones. Instead, I'll walk you through it by listing all of the complaints I have regarding it. A comprehensive guide of why it sucks, if you will. To start off, the enemies in this area cause poison damage, the worst kind of damage in any Soulspawn game barring Frenzy and Toxic. Next, the main path you have to follow here is extremely narrow, and enemies can hit you with a barrage of attacks that will knock you off the platform you're on, if they don't kill you outright, that is. There's no shortcuts in this area, unless you consider a series of faults that pass for a shortcut in this side of Blighttown that you probably don't even know about, and that you don't need to actually play through the area to access in the first place. All the enemies here are just annoying, and the Leechmonger boss at the end of this Home of Despair is a complete pushover if you have any fire attack whatsoever. It only gets worse from here though, because what precedes this is a mandatory poison swamp that slows you down and takes huge chunks of your health bar. As a bonus, the swamp is incredibly difficult to navigate, and while it does have a shortcut, trying to find it and actually opening it is an incredibly tedious task. The next boss is not much better than the Leechmonger, but it has an arena that I found more annoying. It's not hard, it's just boring. The final boss of this area really takes the cake for having the most annoying boss related trophy in the game though. Maiden Astrea sends out her lackey, Garl Winland, to fend you off. Garl is a decently fun NPC fight. Parrying him in particular is incredibly satisfying. But what the trophy needs you to do is beat Astrea without taking out Winland. She defends herself using devastating AoEs, but what makes things even more annoying is the fact that she is in yet another swamp. But now it's one that causes plague buildup, which results in near instant deaths. I hate this area, and I feel like the game would have been better off with one fewer Archstone overall. Back to the good part though. The final area of the game proceeds from the room where we fought the Penetrator. There's a gang of red phantoms congregating near a dragon's carcass, a sight that gave me flashbacks to Dark Souls 2. After recovering from the stress that induced, I found that the fight with these folks was challenging, but not frustrating in the slightest. Climbing up a set of stairs in an abandoned dwelling, the game throws some of the hardest enemies at you, testing your mettle before allowing you to face the final boss. There's another section where you have to avoid flames bellowed down upon you from a dragon, and after you've unlocked a shortcut, there's just one more red phantom and an aggravatingly long elevator ride standing between you and King Allant. The King Allant fight is probably my favorite in the entire game. Allant is one of those humanoid bosses, the types of which FromSoft could put in any game and people would instantly have an affinity for. Don't take the fact that he's fighting you with a melee weapon to mean that he won't punish you for trying to create some distance between yourself and certain deaths though. Like many a Toxic X, Allant has ways of closing the distance when you least expect him to. Unlike Toxic X's, he also has a number of ranged attacks, as well as an AoE that will take you out unless you're interrupted by damaging him enough. Allant is quick, and no matter how close or far from him you are, you have to think on your feet if you want to take him out. He also has a grab attack that literally sucks a soul level for you if you get caught in it. A very meta way of the game saying fuck you for even trying. I love this fight. In a game rife with puzzle bosses, it's only fitting to have the final boss be a straight to the point combat challenge. Once you're done with Allant, the game's still not over, since you do have to return to the Nexus, go down a hole in the floor, and defeat the true boss. an amorphous blob that would only be able to kill you if you accidentally tripped and it used that opportunity to sit on your face. Depending on how evil you're feeling, you can go for one of two endings here, and you could always proceed to New Game Plus to see how well you'll fare against a world that has leveled up. As for me, I had to go through two more playthroughs to get all the trophies in the game, which probably means that this is going to be my most played game for the calendar year of 2023. Having walked you through the entire game, I'll present you with some closing thoughts before I round off this video. I started this video with ramblings about remakes and fidelity. No matter where you stand on the fidelity debate, though, I think that there is no denying the beauty of the remake. Nor is there any doubt that the gameplay systems that FromSoft set into place all those years ago still hold up. Sure, Bluepoint helped round off some edges, but the framework left by the original developers shines through the new coat of paint that the game has been given. What I found to be so interesting while going through the game was just how many of Demon Souls' mechanics have been, and continue to be, iterated upon in newer FromSoft games. This coherent design language makes me commend FromSoft for being able to discern their philosophy so long ago, and for sticking to it while changing it just enough to keep things fresh. I was also struck by just how many of the bosses in Demon Souls had some unique mechanic or quirk that maybe took away from the game's combat a bit, but resulted in each boss feeling very much like their own being. If there's any gripe I have with this game, it's that the boss runs for quite a few of these art stones were just too much. Also, the final two art stones, but especially the final one, seemed like they had been hastily cobbled together with blood and bones of innocent players used as mortar because of just how hard and underbaked they were. Overall, this game is a classic, and I'm all the better for finally having experienced it. The word and character tendency systems can go do one, though.